Imagine being dragged into a lightless void, where the air reeks of rotting flesh and despair, and the stone walls whisper secrets of unspeakable agony. This was the hidden hell awaiting countless women behind the grim facades of medieval dungeons. Picture the scene. The year is 1350 in the shadowed underbelly of a European castle. A woman, perhaps accused of adultery or heresy, is thrust through a heavy iron door that slams shut with a finality that echoes like a death knell.
Please.
The darkness swallows her whole, a blackness so profound it presses against her eyes like a living thing. No torchlight flickers here. Only the occasional drip of fetid water from the ceiling breaks the silence, mingling with the distant moans of other forgotten souls. The cold seeps into her bones immediately, a damp chill that clings like a shroud, born from the underground rivers and sewers that often ran beneath these prisons. In places like Newgate in London or Liestinci in Florence, these dungeons were not mere holding cells. They were instruments of slow, deliberate suffering, designed to break the spirit before the body. As she stumbles forward, chains bite into her wrists and ankles, heavy iron fetters forged to restrain and humiliate. The floor is a slurry of mud, excrement, and straw infested with vermin. Rats scurry over her feet, their tiny claws scratching like accusations, while lice and fleas swarm in the darkness, turning her skin into a battlefield of itch and infection. The smell is overwhelming, a nauseating cocktail of human waste, mold, and decay that coats the throat and lingers in every breath. In these medieval prisons, sanitation was a myth. Prisoners relieved themselves in corners or buckets that overflowed, breeding diseases like typhus and plague that claimed lives as surely as any executioner's axe. Historical records from the 14th century reveal that in London's prisons alone, overcrowding led to outbreaks where dozens perished, their bodies left to rot until the stench became unbearable. But for women, the arrival was often laced with an extra layer of degradation. Unlike men, who might be imprisoned for debts or violence, women were frequently locked away for moral crimes, adultery, gossiping, or simply being deemed a scold. In England, a woman might be stripped of her outer garments upon entry, searched roughly by male guards whose hands lingered too long, a prelude to the violations that often followed. In late medieval Italy, archives from Florence show that female inmates, numbering in the hundreds over the centuries, were herded into separate wards only after 1300. But even then, segregation was haphazard. Poor women, making up the majority, arrived with nothing but the rags on their backs, their children sometimes clinging to them, destined to share the same fate. The emotional toll was immediate, the wail of a hungry infant in the gloom, the knowledge that freedom might never come. This was no swift justice. Imprisonment could last months or years, a limbo where hope festered and died. As the days blurred into an endless night, the daily existence in these dungeons became a symphony of suffering. Dawn brought no light, only the faint clatter of a guard's boots on the stone above, perhaps tossing down a crust of moldy bread or a pail of stagnant water. Food was scarce and wretched. Historical accounts from the 15th century describe rations as little as a penny's worth of bread per day, often rotten and crawling with weevils. Starvation was a constant companion, hollowing cheeks and weakening limbs until prisoners resembled specters. In the Tower of London, where noblewomen like Anne Boleyn were held in relatively better quarters, even they complained of the damp that rotted their clothes and chilled their marrow. But for common women in places like the Marshalsea or Fleet Prison, there were no such mercies. They huddled together for warmth on filthy straw pallets, the air thick with the coughs and gasps of the dying. The sounds were unrelenting, the rattle of chains as a neighbor shifted in agony, the sobs of despair that rose and fell like a dirge, the occasional scream from a torture chamber nearby. Smells intensified with each passing hour, the acrid tang of unwashed bodies, the sweet rot of gangrenous wounds from ill-fitted irons. Fleas bit relentlessly, spreading fever, rats gnawed at toes in the night. Disease was rampant. In one documented outbreak in 1414 at Newgate, over 60 prisoners died from gall fever, a typhus variant thriving in the squalor. Women, often confined in smaller, more crowded spaces, suffered disproportionately. Records from Italian prisons indicate that female wards, though separate, were underfunded, with inmates relying on charity baskets lowered through grates. Baskets that might contain bread, but also taunts from the outside world. Yet, amid this physical torment, the psychological horror deepened. Isolation bred madness. Women whispered prayers or confessions to invisible confessors, their minds fracturing in the void. For those with children, the despair was amplified. Infants born in these dungeons often perished quickly, their tiny cries fading into silence. The atmosphere was one of utter hopelessness, where the stone walls seemed to pulse with the accumulated misery of generations. By the 1400s, efforts at reform, like Richard Whittington's rebuilding of Newgate with a separate women's tower, aimed to alleviate some filth, but the core remained, a place where humanity was stripped away layer by layer. Now let's delve deeper into the gendered cruelties that set women's experiences apart, escalating the nightmare. While men might face brute force for rebellion, women endured humiliations tailored to their perceived weaknesses and societal roles. In medieval Europe, law and custom viewed women as vessels of sin, easily corrupted, leading to harsher scrutiny for feminine offenses. Adultery, for instance, could land a woman in prison while her male counterpart walked free with a fine. Once inside, sexual exploitation was rife. Guards, often unchecked, preyed on female prisoners, their authority a license for assault. Historical petitions from the 15th century in London reveal cases where women like John Hastings were chained in irons not just for restraint, but to facilitate abuse, their pleas ignored by corrupt wardens who demanded bribes for basic decency. Public shaming extended into the prison walls. Devices like the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle with a spiked gag, were clamped onto women's faces for gossip or arguing, piercing the tongue with every word attempted. In Scotland and England from the 16th century, but with roots in medieval practices, this silenced women literally, the metallic taste of blood a constant reminder of their unruly nature. The shrew's fiddle, used in Germany, locked a woman's neck and wrists in a wooden yoke, forcing her into a bowed, submissive posture, paraded before jeering crowds before or after imprisonment. These weren't mere punishments, they were spectacles reinforcing patriarchal control, the clank of the device echoing mockery through the streets. Worse still were the ducking stools, prevalent from the 13th century onward. Accused witches or prostitutes were strapped to a chair and plunged into icy rivers. The shock of submersion meant to cool their tempers or test innocence. If she drowned, she was pure. If she survived, execution followed. The sensory assault was total, the roar of water filling ears, the burning cold seizing lungs, the crowd's laughter fading as blackness closed in. In prisons, such ordeals were preludes. Survivors returned to cells dripping and shivering, their spirits shattered. Records estimate that in Europe, women comprised 80% of those accused in witch hunts, with tens of thousands imprisoned and tortured between 1450 and 1750. This gender bias stemmed from misogynistic doctrines, viewing women as temptresses aligned with the devil, their bodies sites of suspicion. As the intensity builds, we confront the heart of the horror, the torture chambers where confessions were wrung from flesh. Medieval prisons doubled as interrogation sites, especially for women suspected of witchcraft or heresy. The rack, a wooden frame that stretched limbs until joints popped, was a favorite in the Tower of London. Imagine the creak of turning wheels, the searing pain as tendons tore, the inquisitor's voice demanding admissions of pacts with demons. Women, deemed frailer, were often subjected first, their screams filling the dungeons like a chorus of the damned. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, the metallic crunch accompanied by the smell of blood and sweat, pricking where needles probed for witches' marks, spots that didn't bleed, left women riddled with punctures, their skin a map of agony. In oubliettes, the forgotten pits of French and English castles, women were lowered into bottle-shaped holes, too narrow to sit or stand comfortably. The lid sealed above, plunging them into absolute isolation. No food, no water, just the drip of condensation and the scuttle of insects.
Give me that.
Death came slowly from starvation or madness. Bodies left to decompose. One account from Warwick Castle describes such a pit, where graffiti scratched by desperate hands tells of final prayers. For women, these tortures were laced with sexual violence. Inquisitors stripped them, searching for marks in intimate areas, turning examination into violation. The emotional narrative here is stark. These were not random cruelties, but systemic efforts to crush female autonomy, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and blood. Culminating in the ultimate dread, many women's prison ordeals ended in execution, a public theater of cruelty. Burning at the stake, reserved for heresy and witchcraft. Saw women tied to poles amid crackling flames, the heat blistering skin before consuming flesh. The smell of charred meat wafted over crowds, cheers mingling with the victim's final gasps. In England, petty treason, like a wife killing her husband, meant strangling then burning, a fate met by thousands. Hanging drew out the agony, the noose tightening as legs kicked futilely, the snap of neck bones a mercy not always granted. Decapitation, for noble women, was swifter but no less terrifying, the axe whistling down, the thud of head in basket. Escape was rare, bribes or ransoms freed some, but most languished until death. In Italy, feast day releases offered slim hope, but for witches, confession sealed doom. The sensory immersion peaks here, the roar of the mob, the acrid smoke-stinging eyes, the final, haunting silence. Reflecting on these medieval prisons, we uncover profound truths about gender, power, and cruelty. These stone tombs were microcosms of a patriarchal world, where women's bodies became battlegrounds for control, their sufferings tools to enforce submission. With estimates of 40,000 to 60,000 executed for witchcraft, mostly women, these horrors reveal how fear of female independence fueled barbarity. Yet, in the despair, glimmers of resilience shine, petitions scrawled in secret, prayers whispered in the dark. Today, as we peer into this abyss, we're left stunned by humanity's capacity for evil, thoughtful about echoes in modern injustices. The walls may have crumbled, but the lessons endure, reminders that power unchecked breeds monsters, and silence in the face of suffering perpetuates the chains.